Hello there and welcome to History for Thinkers. In this episode, we are going to be continuing our Kampf analysis series. I do apologize for the 8-month hiatus that I've had from this series. It has been a little while, but we are back. We are better than ever. We're going to keep going strong. We're going to finish this dang series if it kills me. And it might, because this is a very difficult read. But with that out of the way, let's continue on. So we're about on page 109 over here, and he's starting this new chapter. He's talking about Munich, and he goes on quite a little bit about how much better Munich is than Vienna. Shots fired right there. But he kind of talks about how Vienna is this Babylon of races, right? Like, they're not true Germans, they're just kind of fakers. You know, those darn Habsburgs and their race mixing, it's ruining Vienna. And it's just always kind of weird to read something like this because, you know, historically speaking, Vienna has been a major powerhouse in Europe. I mean, it's like the London of continental Europe, right? It's like, I mean, there's London, then there's Paris, and then there's Vienna, right? It's not Munich up next, right? No offense, you know, if you're from Munich, I'm sorry. I do not mean to offend you. I'm just stating facts here. And you know, guys, as much as I love pointing out the problems and the flaws and the things Hitler got just completely wrong, I do feel it's only fair to acknowledge when he gets something right. And on this one thing, he just hits the nail on the head. And that is how he talks about geopolitically how the Habsburg monarchy, this dual monarchy that controlled Austria and Hungary, right, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, how they were just an unreliable ally, you know, because he's talking about how he gets over to Munich and a lot of these people are under the impression, falsely, that this dual monarchy, the Austrian Empire, is a good ally, that they're a German state, that they're, you know, a force to be reckoned with. I think that's what the word he uses somewhere in here. And it's just kind of interesting because, well, all it took was World War I to happen, and lo and behold, the Austrian Empire basically crumbled and collapsed. So, you know, as many bad things you can say about Hitler and his warped worldview and opinion on politics and you know, different governments, I think he actually had that one kind of right. You know, maybe not, of course, he's a little biased because he thinks that the Austrians should, you know, be very ethnocentric and very pro-German, right? Join back the German fatherland. So he's kind of colored by that racial view. But I think otherwise, he is kind of right that the Habsburg monarchy is kind of like an old way of running society. I mean, God, when did the Habsburgs start controlling Europe? I mean, like the early medieval period. I mean, that's just crazy to think that here we are in like the 1900s. They're still around. Very strange indeed. So around page 118 or so, he kind of talks about some of the problems with a radically rising population, how Germany can potentially deal with it. So I kind of just summarized it because there's just a whole lot. He goes, you know, some of these points he goes on for a very long time, and it's just a little confusing. So he kind of lays out these 4 different ways that Germany can deal with the problem of a rising population like this. So, number 1, he says basically do what the French are doing, right? Restrict the birth rates. And of course he dislikes this, right? Because that fundamentally means that there's going to be less cannon fodder in the military, right? Not only that, there's the whole racial thing, right? You know, the less of our people exist, the less influence we have in an international sense, the less power we have. So there's that. And then he also goes on this whole Darwinian tangent, right? That we shouldn't restrict the births, let them have kids, and then if the kids die, well, that's natural selection, you know? So that's the, you know, kind of what you would expect from him. And then he kind of talks about this thing called internal colonization. And this one kind of threw me for a bit of confusion because I didn't quite understand what he meant. But from the way he described it, I think it was basically a policy proposal at the time that was essentially making the agriculture more productive, right? Doing more with it. Because, of course, we know that with any given country, there is so much land, so much resources and whatnot, and they're not 100% efficiently used. There's always excess, there's always waste, inefficiencies, and the idea of internal colonization is, we're just going to put the stuff that we do have, right, our land, crops, agriculture, and we're just going to make it better. And he disliked this one, of course, because there is limited soil, so the upside is really limited. There's only, even if you get everything to 100% maximum capacity, there's going to be a drop-off point where, you can't make it any better than that. And at that point, any more population growth will be absolutely devastating. But I think the real reason he dislikes this is because it embraces pacifism, right? He kind of talks about how other races are out colonizing the world and spreading their influence, right? Of course, alluding to Great Britain and France, even some of the smaller European colonial powers. I mean, the Spanish Empire, years ago by this point. But, he just kind of wanted Germany to go out and take stuff, which is why he kind of, for all of these, he has a whole bunch of downside and negatives and, all of them have a whole bunch of writing. There's 10 paragraphs for each of these. Except for this one, where he basically says we need to get more land. He doesn't need to elaborate on that one. It's the obvious choice, man. There's no downside. So I just found that a little humorous, right? He's well, there are about 4 ways that we can go about solving this rising population problem. 3 of them are absolutely terrible. And, I guess we're going to have to go with the least terrible one, right? I mean, take some land. So, of course, this became the ideological justification for Lebensraum, right? Getting more living space for the German people. And this is kind of where that whole idea, that whole movement kind of came about. The idea that our population rate, it's just going to keep going up, and we need to take more land or we're going to run out of resources and land. Which I think at that time, it could have been an understandable fear, I think now that we have our populations have kind of stagnated, at least in the developed world. The United States, Europe, and whatnot, we're not worried that the population is going to shoot up and we're not going to have enough resources for all these new people. We're actually more worried that our population is going to go down. And that completely changes your politics and the way you view the world. So, I don't know, maybe if I lived in a time, I always try to put myself in the other guy's moccasins, right? To steal a quote, saying from Dan Carlin. But I try to put myself in Hitler's mind or any German citizen at this time, right? We have a really geopolitically, militaristically powerful new nation state here. And we are not being respected on the world stage. And we've got this massive growing population. And, well, how are we going to go about solving this problem? We don't know if this population increase is ever going to stop. It might not. At the time, they didn't know it was going to eventually taper off. There was no way of knowing. So, I think it only became logical to kind of think long term, right? Because I think with humans, whenever we start, so we have an idea, we always see it through to the very end. So when it comes to this population increase, I think what really could have been, kind of a subtle idea in the back of everyone's minds was that eventually one day there was just going to be one race left on Earth. Right? Whichever race had the highest population would just eventually replace or kill every other race. And of course, Hitler wanted that to be his race, right? So I guess if I had lived in a time with this crazy rising population, maybe that's how I would have seen the world too. Maybe that's how you would have seen the world. We don't know. I kind of thank my lucky stars that I don't live in this time because there was just so much uncertainty. It wasn't very difficult to get caught up in this kind of crazy stuff. Sorry, long tangent on this third one. But then he kind of talks about international trade and how that can be used to kind of, solve some of the problems of the rising population, right? It doesn't give you more land. It doesn't give you more living space, but it can provide more food and, items that people need, right? Clothing and stuff. And of course, he disliked this one a lot because, number one, it was international capitalism. So there are a lot of people that are opposed to international trade, international capitalism. Typically, those criticisms come from the left, right? We got people like Karl Marx, but with Hitler, it's on a completely different basis because he kind of takes the isolationist self-sufficiency thing to the extreme, and that's what he wants for Germany. He wants Germany to be 100%, we make all our own food, we make all our own stuff, we don't need anyone for anything. Because when you rely on other countries for, your goods or your foods or what have you, well, what you're doing right there is giving them leverage. Because if they have some kind of problem with you, they can say, oh, hey, change this, or we're not going to send you any more food. And then your people are going to starve and die. They're going to blame you. And that is a really, really bad situation to be in. And Germany would know. This would especially be at the forefront of their mind. I'm surprised he even listed this one because I don't think anyone was really in the mindset of adopting this one. I think he did. He debunked it pretty well, but there was really not a lot of German support for, let's rely on international trade because, World War I just happened, and, the British blockade and trade restrictions basically killed, hundreds of thousands of German citizens, right? So I don't think anyone was really big for international trade. But, so, when you listen to it like this, when you're like, all right, we've got this rising population problem. How are we going to solve this? Okay, number one, we can't restrict the birth rates. Our race is going to lose the race war. All right. Then we got internal colonization. Again, we're going to lose that race war, and it's pacifism. Someone else is going to eventually kill us, take some land, and then international trade, which again, most people just would not have been in favor of. So when you read one source like this, I really see how, things like technology and information, the way we communicate our ideas. Because, here's the thing you always got to remember. People always talk about political extremism rising on the internet today. And that's because there are people who otherwise never would have had access to broadcast technology that now do, right? Any crazy ideologue can go on Instagram or Facebook or, YouTube or what have you. And they can say, oh, hey, we live on a square, right? Or, whatever other crazy things are out there these days. So with that, you always have to think about how this was kind of playing a role at this point in history as well. Because if you were someone that was reading something like, Mein Kampf, you probably weren't reading, you weren't balancing the spectrum, right? You weren't reading Mein Kampf and then going and reading a communist pamphlet to, kind of get a balanced view of the world. No one did that. You got your ideological fix and you read it and you regurgitated those points and you didn't do a lot of thinking, and that's just kind of how it goes. And it's also going on today. So whenever you see someone that's a political extremist, just remember that the same human psychological mechanisms that it gave rise to Hitler are also giving rise to these new crazy movements. But that's a very long tangent. Let's continue. Now, here's another point where I actually think he has something really interesting to say. So he's kind of talking about the whole colonization thing, right? The British Empire and whatnot, and how you cannot really compare England or the British Empire in general to other continental European powers because, for the most part, right, they would have to do a whole lot to conquer territory in Europe. And it would just be a lot easier because of their naval capacity to just sail a little bit further and take stuff from weaker people, right? Because that's essentially what the British Empire did. They didn't sail to Europe and say, all right, let's fight, right? They didn't colonize France. So what they did was they sailed and they found people that were technologically inferior than them, right? And then they basically took their stuff and killed them. And, if they resisted, killed them some more, right? So that was basically that. But with Germany, where their military was primarily focused on the army, they had a much harder time, going far away to Africa or Asia or somewhere in the Americas. For Germany, it was just much more convenient to just fight for more territory in continental Europe. And I think this is kind of, I don't think this is the point he's trying to make, but I kind of take it away from this. This is why the British Empire was kind of successful. More so, it was the largest empire in the world for a long time. And it was largely because all these other European states that were potential competitors, right? Because Germany, France, even Russia, they were all potential competitors to Great Britain, but they never could get their act together, even with massively higher populations, right? I mean, Germany really could have been a world power. France really was a colonial power, but nowhere near as good as Britain. And the reason for that was because these European states, they were just on land fighting each other, and that was just kind of the struggle they were going through. And then you compare that with the British Empire, who could just sail away and just take stuff and slowly build up. And that was the strategy that won the game long term. And now we have crossed a point where it's just too dramatic to not read out. So let's read this little Mein Kampf quote here. So he's talking about the geopolitical situations and how most countries were trying to avoid war, but it ultimately turned into war. And, just generally on that topic, he's going on for a little bit. So Hitler writes, quote, "They thought to cut loose from the cords of destiny, but destiny held them fast. They dreamt of maintaining a world peace and woke up to find themselves in a world war." I just find it so interesting because he has so many different influences throughout this. I mean, in some ways you can read this as a political manifesto or an autobiography or, like a historical epic, right? It's like all of these things in one, and it's just such an entertaining piece. And that's why I have a YouTube channel where I do nothing but almost exclusively talk about this book. It's wonderful. I've always found it weird that there's really one person throughout history that is most strongly associated with propaganda. And of course, as we know that person today, that was Joseph Goebbels, the head of the propaganda ministry in the Third Reich, right? A Nazi. So what's interesting about that is the Germans have not historically been good at propaganda. Because when you really think about it, propaganda, the way people think, their preconceptions, their prejudices, that is going to shape so many things about so many different situations and circumstances. Because, when you think about the way the English and then by extension the Americans did propaganda, the enemy was always a savage brute. And, maybe that spawned as a result of Great Britain constantly fighting, barbarians, right? People with lower civilization. Maybe that was an extension of that. But the propaganda worked because British people, they never for once thought that they were fighting an idiot. They never let their guard down. They were always thinking, right in their mind, they were like, yeah, we are fighting absolute monsters. These people are bad. They need to die. We need to subjugate them because we're the good guys. And I think that is such a powerful narrative to have on your side. Because you compare this to how the Germans thought about different groups of people. And Hitler really points this out, how they just kind of thought that the British were cowards, right? Maybe they're really good as a collective civilization, but individually, they're just cowards and businessmen, right? And then he has this interesting little quote here. I'll read this for you. So Hitler says about his German comrades, quote, "I can vividly recall to mind the astonished looks of my comrades when they found themselves personally face to face for the first time with the Tommies in Flanders." Of course, the Tommies are the British, and Flanders, that World War I battlefield. So what was going on here was the Germans underestimated. They thought that the British were jokes. And as a result, they got their butts handed to them on numerous occasions. Now, that didn't take away from the fact that the Germans were themselves formidable people, right? I mean, they were pretty tough, right? Again, everyone always says that Germany was the world superpower that coulda, shoulda, woulda been. But when you have something so prevalent in your society where you think you're fighting a bunch of cowards and clowns, you're not going to give it your all. You're not going to give it your A game. But you compare that to how the British and the Americans did it. We're fighting savage brutes. I mean, you remember that one World War, British World War I propaganda poster. Because this one was so good. Because it perfectly encapsulates how they felt about it, right? Destroy this mad brute, enlist. I mean, this is grade A propaganda right here. This is how you whip people up and you get them to really attack, right? And you get the most out of them. Especially because, we're fighting this guy. We're doing a good for the world, right? And they also call the Germans Huns, right? Which was ironic considering the Nazi racial thing, right? Weird how but hey, the propaganda stuck, right? So propaganda is so important. The way your people think about another group of people determines a lot. It made a big difference in World War I. And I would say it probably made a big difference in World War II as well, because that wasn't that much later. We don't know how many German civilians or German people changed their minds about the British after World War I, right? With the Tommies in Flanders. So that is an interesting reminder that propaganda, the way your people think, it is not irrelevant when it comes to war. In fact, I would put it in the category of a weapon in your arsenal. Because if you use it right, you can prevent situations like this. Quote, "After a few days of fighting, the consciousness slowly dawned on our soldiers that these Scotsmen were not like the ones we had seen described and caricatured in the comic papers and mentioned in the communiques. They were not comic book clowns." It's really interesting. I'm about 126 pages through this book, and I'm now starting to notice a pattern. These chapter headings make absolutely no sense. I mean, this is still in that Munich chapter. And yeah, he started talking about Munich, but I mean, he has stopped talking about Munich a very long time ago. I mean, he's talking about the population struggle, and I mean, all the things we talked about in this episode already, and then a bunch of other stuff. So I have no idea how he organized this thing. It is not very coherent. It is, I just really feel like Hitler just sat down and just brain dumped everything in his brain. And that's what Mein Kampf really is. My friends, we have come to the point in Mein Kampf where we have to actually really think about what it is that he's saying here. Because he makes a pretty compelling point, but it's not obvious right away why he's wrong. I do think that he is wrong, but we'll get into that. So I'm going to read it to you and then we can discuss it a little bit. So Hitler writes, quote, "The instinct for the preservation of one's own species is the primary cause that leads to the formation of human communities. Hence, the state is a racial organism and not an economic organization." So he makes this very strong distinction between these two things. There is the state that exists to serve the race, And there is this state that exists to, make money, right? Encourage economic activity, just some random chaos. And when you have these two categories, these two distinctions, and you have Darwinian evolution at the forefront of your mind, it really is, I would say, forgivable to fall victim to this kind of thinking. Because it is not obvious why this is a flawed way of viewing the world. Because, he does have a point, right? We evolved in tribes, right? These tribes gradually grew to be larger organizations of people, eventually became early states. And generally it was people who shared a race or, ethnicity, a certain lineage. And that really is the foundation when you think about it like that. However, I would say that there is one major problem with this way of viewing the world and the state in general. And that is the idea that evolution only applies to living organisms, specifically humans. The idea that I don't think it's very out there to say that the state started as a racial organism. Because when you go back, we were hunter-gatherer tribes. People did not cooperate because, they just randomly liked each other. They cooperated because they, hey, if you live and I live, we can pass on our genes. It was mutually beneficial. I don't think that's very out there to say. In fact, I would say that is the way it went, and at least as far as I'm concerned. However, the problem is that this same thinking does not apply to the modern day nation state. You're looking at a small nomadic tribe of maybe 20, 30, 50 people and comparing that to the modern day nation states of, Europe and the world even, and saying, oh yeah, the same thing applies to a nation of 80 million people. No, it doesn't. No, it does not. Especially because, number one, as crazy racial purist as you can get, you're never going to be 100% racially pure. And on top of that, it is just infeasible. You just can't do it. I always try to think about it in a way of what separates societies like, the Third Reich from the United States is that we are not an economic organization, right? Like maybe that's one way you can view us, but to say we are only that thing is kind of to do it a disservice. When you really look at it, we are a people of shared values, right? The British Empire, a people of shared values, Is there a racial component to it? Are we also economic organizations? Yes. But those are not above the shared values component. And that's where I think Hitler really, the idea of virtue in his mind, like it doesn't matter, right? He is 100% will to power, dominate, or be dominated. There is no being good. And I think that is one of the natural things that happen when you put Darwinian evolution at the center of your political worldview, because you apply it to things that it should not be applied to, and you end up with some pretty wacky stuff. And if you were a person at this time and you were interested in this kind of discussion, and you really thought about, okay, should the state be organized around our racial purity or our economic organization, I don't think a lot of people would say that, oh yeah, make the monies, Because generally, right, money is generally frowned upon, money is the root of all evil, so on and so forth. I don't think they would land on the same side, right? They wouldn't all be racial purists or Nazis or whatever if they understood that the modern day nation states are not organizations of economics, but shared values, which is a very abstract thing. And again, it goes back to this idea that you can apply evolution to certain things, but do it evenly. The states of modern day Europe, they evolved. maybe at one time, yeah, they were just, family clans and then larger family clans, right? But to say that they are, still holding the same principle is kind of goofy. So, when people in the United States, we're not an economic organization. We're not a company. Or don't ask the conspiracy theorists about that, though. The United States is a company. We are a people of shared value, right? Even people that are on either end of the spectrum politically, we can all come together and say, okay, yeah, freedom of speech is good. Oh, yeah, liberty. Oh, yeah, we should protect, people from the government. All these different ideas. And I think that is a much better thing to organize a civilization around than race, right? And then he brings in his whole martyr complex. So, we're supposed to die for the race, right? And again, it's just so much easier to have this martyr complex for, oh, I'm not dying for me. I'm doing it for our people, right? I'm not dying for some words, some abstract ideas that don't mean anything to anyone. I'm giving my life for you people, right? And then he has this little poet, he quotes a poet down here and he says, quote, "And if you do not stake your life, you will never win life for yourself." So it's all about the sacrifice of the individual existence. I actually talked a whole lot about individualism and collectivism in the most recent PostScript episode. So I will leave a link to that in the description. You can check it out for like $5 on Gumroad. If you are a patron, you can pay $10 a month and get all PostScript episodes as well. So that's a pretty good deal. And then he has this whole little rant down here where he's kind of talking about how, it's difficult to understand how countries can form based on, economic forces, right? He's like, there's been so much proof in every phase of history, right? And then he talks about Prussia and how, people were formed the state from moral virtues. And of course, the history of Prussia is really the history of, basically colonization and demographic displacement. There actually were not a whole lot of Germans in Prussia. It was, I believe, primarily a Baltic people that lived there, and they were not German. They didn't speak German. They didn't think of themselves as German. But one of the monarchs of Europe really encouraged German settlement there, and gradually the Germans came to basically run the place. So, and again, I would argue that it was only out of geopolitical maneuvering and the shared culture that Prussia was able to form. It wasn't because this racial component, right? No one at the time cared about race. So the idea that people that didn't think or care about race formed a country on the basis of race, it's just the kind of revisionist history that someone like Hitler is capable of. And just about every time he writes about history, right? There's always he's always trying to insert this racial component. He's always trying to look back on history, take his own political beliefs and say, oh yeah, they were on board. He does this with Bismarck and Frederick the Great, even Prussia here. Prussia, they formed this great state because, racialism. No. And he does point out it was in economic circumstances. No, well, that's true, but it was not out of moral virtues of a pure race. So, again, pretty wacky stuff. But I think that is going to be it for this episode. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for the next episode. I promise it will not be 8 months before the next episode comes out. I can't guarantee you how quickly I can get this done, but it will get done in a much shorter time, right? Only 6 months. 6 months tops. No, it'll be sooner than that. So if you guys like this series, and surprisingly many of you do, I was very pleasantly surprised. I got quite a few people messaging me and commenting, asking to continue this series, which is why I'm here. So you're welcome. But anyway, thank you so much for tuning in, guys. I really appreciate you. This has been History for Thinkers, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.